No, I won't. It's good to be here. Okay, so the next thing is to look at some explanations for educational underachievement, and the one I want to start with, there's things called hereditarian. Actually, is there a clock here? There are things called hereditarian explanations, which are basically racist explanations about certain people being inherently more intelligent than others, and still a few people who push those, but basically we can dispense with them. But this idea here, cultural deficit theory, is a much more significant one to have a look at. Sometimes called cultural deficit theory, sometimes called cultural deprivation theory. And the idea here is that this is an idea that views Maori family background as deprived and inappropriate for school success. So the focus is not on the genes; it's on the family context. This is an idea that says that Maori families are dysfunctional, that they fail to socialise children correctly, and that the consequence of this impoverished, deficient family background is that it retards cognitive development, that it slows down the ability of kids to learn the things that they would otherwise be able to learn. And if you kind of go out, and this is a rather blunt description of it, but this is what it boils down to. And if you just sort of picked somebody randomly off the street and presented them with the data of educational inequalities, and said, how do you explain this? You probably still today get some variation of cultural deficit theory. But back in the 1960s, it was all the rage, and there's a UNESCO report. I think again Greg made some reference to this report, published in 1969, a report on education in New Zealand with particular focus on Māori, and it's a really interesting illustration of what the thinking was at the time and what cultural deficit theory thinking is all about. It says Māori underachievement is not because of any lack of intellectual that Māori underachievement is not the result of any lack of intellectual ability, so it's a rejection of that hereditarian argument. They are hindered rather by a number of other factors, such as language disability, that's English language disability because that was assumed, a lack of motive, and the conflict of the cultural values of home and school. So there's a clash between, this is this cultural deficit theory, cultural deprivation theory, of the sort of cultural practices that go on at home, ways of being, the broader sense of culture, and the sorts of things that are expected at school. And the report goes on and says, Māori children from homes where English is constantly spoken, where a good deal of European culture has been absorbed, where vocational ambition has been directed towards work requiring skill and training, and where the basic morality and ideals are high, appear to be able to acquire and use the tools of European learning with a facility that equals that of the Europeans. For the most part, these are Māori children whose parents have already absorbed European culture, one or both of them perhaps, partly European ancestry as well. And then it goes on to make this statement, which I don't know if you looked at old exam papers, but I've used that as an exam question in the past to have a look at this statement here. Not all Māori take advantage of the educational opportunities that are available. And that kind of sums up the whole thing, really. I won't go on to discuss that just yet. I want to just press the pause button there and move on to just hold that thought about that last comment. Move on to this notion of meritocracy. Have you come across the word meritocracy before? Okay, so meritocracy is a really kind of, if there's one fundamental concept in the sociology of education that is important to understand, seriously, the most important concept, I think, is the concept of meritocracy. Up until relatively recently, in the big scheme of things, in most societies, the social status and the wealth and power that people had were pretty much set at birth. Pretty much set at birth. So people had a fixed standing in society, and their kids assumed that same position that they did, and that was sort of set in concrete and was very hard to alter in sort of feudal societies and further back. The 20th century really kind of broke all that up. It broke all that up, and in particular, mass education. The opening up of education systems to everybody in Western societies, at least, and some other societies as well. Everybody is able to go to school, whereas previously they couldn't. Previously, school was just for the preserve of the wealthy. And with this mass education came whole new ideas, and what emerged was a situation where, instead of your position in society being predetermined from birth, it was increasingly the result of your educational achievements. So people could gain what's called social mobility. People from poor parents could gain wealth and status by achieving at school, getting educational qualifications, and getting ahead. And schooling was opened up. So effectively these opportunities were there and open to people where previously they simply hadn't been. And the idea behind all this, about opening it all up and making all this available, was that you would create a situation where social success could be could be earned by educational success. You succeed in education, you can succeed in society. And educational success could also be earned on merit. So you succeed in everybody's allowed to go to the same school. And so success or failure in education is on the basis of merit. You earn your success in education, and you deserve your failure in education, because the education system has been opened up and everybody can go to it. And education rewards your achievement, which is the result, your merit, which is the result, broadly speaking, of your ability and your effort. Your ability and understanding and the effort that you put in. And that combination of ability and effort is what, so the theory goes, earns you your educational success, or that lack of ability and or effort results in your educational failure. So you have a situation where there is still an unequal society, but there is equality of opportunity. And so this notion of meritocracy and equality of opportunity are really closely bound together. That people have different standings in society, people have different levels of achievement and education, but they're not set in stone and imposed on them from the moment they're born. They are the result of what they do themselves. It's what people do themselves that produce these unequal outcomes. And so there is a degree of what's seen as fairness before, now where there wasn't previously. And that's the just before I go on. So that's the idea. That's the idea of a meritocracy, that you have an education system that rewards people on the basis of merit, that everybody has an equal opportunity to do well in, and that on the basis of how well you do in education, you can improve your social standing, your standing in your wealth and prestige in society. And that standing that you end up with, that high standing, is standing that you have earned yourself. And so the education system, so the theory goes, gives everybody an opportunity to assume those high positions in society. But if you have a closer look, you see that despite education being more open than previously, certain sorts of people still tended to do well in education, and other certain sorts of people tended not to. And throughout this whole century and a bit of this, you see factors such as class and ethnicity are major predictors of educational success and failure. So there's something else beyond just the individual characteristics of people that is contributing to this. Education, despite being open to everybody, you know, with public school systems going to the same institutions, tended to reproduce social inequalities across generations. So although there was some social mobility, people, the same sorts of people with class and gender profiles, and ethnic profiles, tended to do well, and the same sorts of people tended to not do so well. But the theory goes, so that if everybody attends the same educational institutions with the same teachers, the difference in outcome must be personal characteristics. That's what the myth says. Everybody's there, everybody's at the same institution. This person does well, this person doesn't do well, so it's all to do with their personal characteristics. The power of this system is, again, there's sort of notions of hegemony. It's not crude situations where certain sorts of people were denied the ability to have education and were denied this opportunity and that opportunity. There is this openness in education, but there is still the reproduction of inequalities. So inequalities are being reproduced in much less obvious ways, in much more sophisticated ways. Success is gained by merit. It is not gained just by accidents of birth. Success is earned. People who do well in society, do well in education, do well in society, deserve to have those high positions because they've earned it. And equally, failure is earned as well. You've had the opportunity, you didn't do so well, you could have done well, you didn't, you failed, it's your fault. You're not at the bottom of the heap because your parents were at the bottom of the heap. You're at the bottom of the heap because you didn't do well enough in the education system. And so you have a situation where inequalities are being reproduced, but there is this appearance of fairness. And this forms a powerful justification for social and economic inequality. And you hear these sorts of explanations all the time, you know, with all these sort of opportunities. And the more there are examples of, you know, somebody who's kind of done really well against the odds, the argument goes, well, if that person could do it, why couldn't everybody do it? Why couldn't you do it? You didn't do well, you know, why didn't you do what this person did? They didn't have any advantages either. So there's always one. It doesn't work absolutely, but there's always one or two who get through, who are used as examples of that. Education is particularly influential in this whole system of legitimation because it gives the appearance of this all being a fair process. And that's one of the real powerful things about it, that education operates in complex ways. It's a really fundamentally complex enterprise operation that people are engaged in. There aren't clear, obvious causes and effects, and it has presents the image of being open and free and fair, and so when it has the effect of reproducing inequalities over time, it has a powerful legitimizing effect for those inequalities. So let me just, in light of that bit about, I needed to say something about meritocracy in order to come back to this issue about cultural deficit theory and explain to you why I think there are some fundamental problems with it. That you think of those explanations for the UNESCO report for why Māori were doing badly at school. And the critical underlying thing of the whole, assumption of the whole thing, is that the problem was not with the education system, the problem was with Māori. And that's what that's what deficit theories do. They place the problem with the people who are not achieving, not with the system. And so if the problem lies within the people, then the solution lies with the people too. So what cultural deficit theory does, is it steers you towards saying, what's wrong with those Maoris that they can't do this? So what do we need to do about them to get them to do this? Rather than saying, what is it about the education system that is having this effect where a whole heap of people are underachieving in it, the focus is what's wrong with these people. So it's sometimes called a Eurocentric theory, that it assumes the Europeanization of education. That was not questioned in those things. The Hun report was the same. The Hun report, that UNESCO report, it was assumed that education was all about European knowledge, and that for Māori education involved, you know, taking as much of that on as they possibly could. It also is sometimes called a blame the victim approach. You have a situation where there's a whole group of people who are underachieving in education, and where's the blame lie? The blame lies with those people. The blame doesn't lie with the system. But as I said before, it is still fundamentally the default option. You know, if you go ask somebody in the street about this, they'll give you some variant of that. And it also underlies a lot of educational intervention. No Child Left Behind in the States, Head Start, homework groups, books in school, books in homes, programs aimed at focusing on what it is about those families that means that their kids aren't achieving. Doesn't mean that things can't be achieved and that those things are all bad, but if the focus is entirely on that, then you're going to get very limited outcomes, and that is actually what's happened. You look at the history of those sorts of interventions, they have not been successful. And you know, you think back to those issues about meritocracy and so on, as you think of the critique of this cultural deficit theory. Got a couple of minutes, so let me just roll on a little bit with the sort of historical narrative. And the first thing I want to say is that when you look at how education policy developed, there's the Hun report, and then a decade later there was this report of the National Advisory Committee on Māori Education in 1970, and that report came up with 46 recommendations, still along the same kind of lines, but it eventually was a report that gave rise to a program known as Taha Māori. Again, another decade later. This is how slowly things moved. We've got the Hun report in 1960, you got this NACME report in 1970. It wasn't until the 1980s that Taha Māori was introduced. And it's worth just having a comment on this for the couple of minutes that we got left before the camera number 2 runs out of battery, runs out of room. Taha Māori program, literally the Māori side, is what it means. And the idea was that this was a Ministry of Education initiative that would introduce things Māori, like waiata, kapahaka and so on, into the mainstream school curriculum to create a positive image of Māori. The idea, and it was in line with lots of other sort of multicultural programs overseas, was that it would help everybody at school. For Māori, it would make them feel more comfortable and at ease in the school by seeing a bit more of the Māori world around them and Māori culture around them. And for non-Māori, it would create a better understanding of and sympathy for Māori through the same sorts of programs. And so this was the first kind of systematic introduction of things Māori into the school curriculum. Graham Smith wrote a really interesting critique of this, which he called Taha Māori Pākehā Capture. And in this he has 4 elements of critique, which I'll go through a couple of. First of all, he is critical of what is called this sort of self-esteem approach. Partly on the basis that this just kind of facilitates cultural imperialism. And if you have a radical critique of what the schooling system is overall, the impact that it's having on Māori culture and on Māori kids, then in a sense you could argue that having a bit of this Māori culture, just the Taha Māori stuff, just kind of added into the curriculum was just kind of making this whole process a bit more palatable. And so with this cultural imperialism critique of schooling, it was making what was still fundamentally an alien Pākehā system a bit more palatable. So that was part of what he was talking about, the self-esteem approach. The other one was pointing out that it's expecting way too much for an education system to radically alter and improve a Māori pupil's self-esteem when there's all sorts of other stuff that are happening outside that institution, in society, in that kid's world. You know, the unemployment rates, imprisonment rates, those sorts of housing conditions and so on, that having a few waiata and kapahaka in school is not going to outweigh, you know, going seeing your uncle in prison or other, you know, impacts like that. So I was expecting way too much for this to fundamentally change people's experience of the world. The second one was that the way this plan was to be implemented did nothing to affect power and control in the education system. That the program itself was developed without Māori by Pākehā education bureaucrats and politicians who thought, oh, I know, this would be a good thing to do, and was being implemented essentially by non-Māori, by principals, parents, boards of trustees, and so on. So it did nothing to alter the sort of fundamental power and control of what was going on in schools. It was also easily subverted by antagonistic Pākehā. So people who weren't into it, even though they weren't antagonistic, as long as they just weren't into it, it could be put alongside attractive subjects. It was put alongside attractive subjects, you know, PE, art and music and so on, or could be left out altogether. So it wasn't even something that everybody had to do. And the final thing, which is related to the overall title of his article, Taha Māori Pākehā Capture, was that really mostly what Tā Māori was doing, he argued, was educating Pākehā about Māori, and educating Pākehā about essentially about Māori, about select elements of Māori culture, which is fine, But if your objective is, if your starting point is saying, look at the crisis of facing Māori culture, facing Māori education, this program, you think if the resources put into this, and if this is mostly what it does, what is that actually going to do to address that crisis that Māori are facing in culture and in education? His argument was it's actually still more resources for Pākehā education. So the next kind of stage of things is a period of Māori radicalism, and you've got a hint of that with that critique from Graham Smith about that. But I might just stop there. Promised I wouldn't go on forever, and we can have perhaps a bit of koiro about that. Thanks.